else is happening? Hello? Hello? Is that different? Oh, great. Yes. Oh, that is different. These are magic, I just found out, because there's no moving parts. It's very exciting. Welcome. My name is Danielle Walker-Palmore, and I am the director of Friends Provident Foundation, and welcome to our conference. It's great to see so many of you in person and also online, because this is our foray into hybrid, so I hope it's all working. Do give some kind of indication on Twitter or other ways if it's not working, hybrid people. Fantastic to see you. I am here basically to welcome you and to do what I think is probably on your agenda as sort of an energy raiser or an icebreaker or something. It sounds very active. And so I'm going to have a go at that. But before I do that, I was asked by Kat, who checked you guys all in at reception, to ask you to have a look at your badge, and you've got a little shape near your name. That is part of our logo, but it is also vital for the networking, which will happen later. And don't ask me anything about it, because I didn't organize this bit, so I don't know what's going to happen. It's going to be brilliant, though, because it always is. So without further ado, I'm going to ask you to all stand up or raise your hand if standing is not available to you. Okay, brilliant. Okay, we're going to do a Graham Norton type, old school, maybe, I don't know, maybe you guys are all too young for this, but anyway, he used to do this thing, which was stay standing, okay, do you know? So stay standing, and I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and then if it doesn't apply to you, have a seat. Okay, first one, stay standing if you are a Friends Provident grant holder or investee. So some of the people who've sat down are advisors and some of our trustees. So do have a look around. If anyone is not an advisor or a trustee, do say who you are. I'm curious to know myself. Okay, right. Okay, so next one is, oops, going to get my little list. Stay standing if, oh dear, lost my place. Okay. If your organization is a living wage employer. That was a compliance question, so I'm really pleased. I am so pleased that you know what's that now. I'm so relieved for you. Okay, and this is not a stay standing question, but if anyone can name the living wage outside London, you get an extra biscuit. Anyone know what it is? It just changed. 12 quid. Exciting news. And it's very likely that the national living wage will go up next year to 11, but it's still not the same. Very important. Okay, moving on. My economics question is finished. That's it. Okay, stay standing if you traveled more than 5 miles to get here. Okay, the Londoners sat. Okay. And that includes, like, where you live, sorry. If you came from Premier Inn, that you still traveled further. Okay. Stay standing if you, if you traveled more than 5 but less than 10. Okay. And stay standing if you traveled 50 miles, over 50 miles to get here. Okay. Where have you come from? Over here? Is anyone here? Yeah. Where have you come from the furthest? Oxford. Sorry? I'm going to start disputing it now. Okay. All right. How many have we got standing still? Okay, fair number. Okay. Stay standing if you listen to podcasts. Well, some people don't. No. Okay. Stay standing if you listen to economics podcasts. Yeah. That's fine. Okay. So people who do listen to economics podcasts, can you name like one good one that you like?
The New Economics Foundation podcast.
Yeah, that's always a good one. Any others? For economics. Excellent. Good tips, everybody. Okay, we're getting very low here. Now, I'm going to skip a few. Stay standing if your organization has instituted a 4-day week. Ooh, it's getting tricky, getting trickier. Okay, this is one that's going to clear the floor. It's going to be very inclusive. Stay standing if you have read the Friends Provident grant holders' terms and conditions in the last 2 months. No, I'm going to ask, I'll test on this question. I knew they would work. I told the team, I know one everyone will sit down for. No one will be standing at the end of it. So, yeah. The one thing I would want to... You are you? Oh, you win. I just thought, no one. I'm buying the drinks, guys, because I said no one will be standing. So there you go. One thing I wanted to do, though, is to make the team... I was trying to work out a way that the only people standing at the end were Friends Provident Foundation staff and trustees, but that didn't really work. So I just wanted to ask the staff team, because you'll see trustees. We have one trustee, a new trustee, Caroline. Caroline, you can stand up just quickly. So Caroline's here, and she's come from Essex. But I was going to get the team to stand. We're missing one member of my team, who's Charlie, who's got COVID, who's joining us in hybrid, so he's waving at you virtually from home. You'll be pleased to hear, not bringing COVID. But I'm going to ask the team to stand and say hi. You can say hello, and as you go. Jake, do you want to start?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Jake. I'm Communications Manager for Friends Provident Foundation.
Hi, I'm Jo. I'm a grants manager, so a few of you familiar faces in here. And I'm Abby, I'm a health and grants team fellow. And I'm Kat, I'm a office manager, a job share with Caroline, but she's holding the floor.
Yeah, brilliant. And we've got Kate, who's our finance person who you may liaise with, and we've mentioned Caroline. So Caroline Watson, who's back in York. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our chair, Stephen Muirs, who's going to introduce the first panel.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Danielle. Lovely to see everyone. As Danielle said, I'm Stephen Muirs. I'm chair of the foundation. And I'd like to get my 3 panelists to come up to the stage for our first session. Then I'll introduce everyone. So if you could all come up here, that would be great. I hope everyone's here. I've seen a couple of the panel, but please come on up. Grab a seat. Oh, one of the mics on the floor there. Grab a chair. Excellent. So we thought that for this conference, we thought sometimes the opening session of a conference is a nice sort of light, easy, simple topic to get people into the swing of things. We absolutely are not doing that. We're starting with a really hard, complicated, difficult topic. We thought everyone's had their coffee first thing in the morning. They can cope with something that's challenging, hopefully thinking big and in an interesting way to get you all fired up. And I've got a brilliant panel to talk about that, who I will introduce in just a minute. So the purpose of this panel is to talk about systems change, and particularly unleashing what we call unleashing the power of systems thinking to create long-term impact. Now, at Friends Provident, we've for a long time been interested in trying to take a sort of systemic perspective to what we fund and what we do, trying to get to underneath underlying causes and dynamics that drive the economic system that we have, and what we can do to try and change some of that through the limited amount of resource and activity that we can bring to bear. And my sense is that this sort of frame of systems thinking is getting more popular. I hear more funders, more organisations, more commentators of talking about it and using that sort of framework, which is great and interesting, and opens up some opportunities. But there's also challenges and risks around this, which I think we'll probably get into some of in the session. Can seem a bit vague sometimes and quite hard to explain to people. And so what does it actually mean? Potentially you can get sort of paralyzed by thinking, oh, there's this huge complex system that I'm just a small part of. How do I understand all this before I make anything happen? It can lead to sort of bias towards kind of overthinking and not taking action, potentially, if you get stuck. And so potentially also sort of get too much internal navel gazing and not enough getting things done. So those are some of the pitfalls that can happen with a systems perspective, but I'm very confident that the panel today, who are all very experienced in thinking in this way, will help us break through some of that and come up with some positive ideas for what we can take forward. So I'm just going to introduce my three panelists running along from this side. So I have Dan Firth from the New Economics Foundation, where he's Director of Campaigns and Engagement and has a background in community organising. I have Kohinoor Chowdhury from Share Action, who works on their Good Work programme, looking at things like the ethnicity pay gap and racial equity in the workplace and employment. And finally, at the end, Indy Johar, who's Director of Dark Matter Labs, among various other initiatives that he's involved in, and has a long history of work on systems change and systems thinking. So in a minute, I'm going to ask them all to speak for 5 to up to 10 minutes. So we'll get some opening thoughts. I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to then use to prompt some discussion, but we'll also have time for questions from the floor, because we've got a good chunk of time allotted for this session until an hour and a quarter, in fact. So we've got plenty of time to do questions as well from the floor. So I'm going to start at the far end of the panel and work back along. So Indy, I'd like to ask you to kick off, please.
Okay. Good morning. It's a bit of a cold start, but I'm going to jump in. Look, the reason why I think this is a really critical conversation is, I would argue, since 2004, most of the kind of innovation space has been working at the marginal ends of innovation. I'm going to be slightly difficult here. I would say impact investment has been marginal to the challenge that we're facing. Why I say that is that I'm going to put this through a lens, which is that our capital markets are fundamentally self-terminating us. Our capital markets are allocating money to things that are terminating us as societies and civilization. And I think we have to start by understanding the scale of what we're talking about. And if we're not reforming those, we're all dead in the water. We're literally all dead in the water. So when we talk about systems change, why system change becomes relevant is that system change is actually about changing the structural systems that are available to us and how they're organizing the world around us. So first, macro position. Second, I think what's really critical is that when we start to talk about this, what also becomes clear is that systems are becoming visible to us. They've always been there. That visibility is a function of increased volatility in the system. So as the world becomes more volatile, more fragile, we are becoming more aware of our system interlinkages. And that can be driven through whether it's persistent levels of sort of inflation, because actually what we're seeing is actually volatility of global supply chains, volatility geopolitics, and also climate breakdown effects start to have significant impacts into how we're thinking about the world. So, for example, we lose one of our major food baskets between 1.7 to 1.9 degrees. India last year cancelled the export of rice globally. So rice and food, critical foods, are no longer a global commodity, but they're geopolitical assets that are operating in a different way. The volatility that starts to drive is food prices, right? So these are linked into our food prices. Now, at the same time, why this food prices? So we'd had a 40% increase in food prices in the UK, right? We've seen many people innovating around the cost of living, but the reality is none of us were prepared for the scale of volatility that was on the table, right? None of us were prepared for the scale of volatility. And that volatility will increase as we see climate breakdown, not climate change, climate breakdown drive a situation where we lose predictability, we lose insurability, and we lose capital markets to be able to invest into that. Now, why is that critical? Well, actually what we're going to have to drive is structural land reform to be able to actually reinvent our food nutrition markets, and we're going to have to do that to be able to build actually our biomaterial economies. So currently, let me give you an example. How many homes do you think the UK can afford to build if it was to operate within the Paris Accord, which it signed up to legally? The whole of the UK. A number. zero. It's about 14,000 homes. Every government that comes in claims to sort of say, hey, we're going to build 350,000 homes. But actually, we don't have the carbon budgets to deliver those homes. And people then turn around and say, we're going to have timber homes. Well, global timber supply chains versus concrete give you a 5% deviation. So if you build with a global timber supply chain, you have 5% less carbon use. That's it. We need to get 95% reduction of our carbon. In order to do that, we're going to need bioregional, biomaterial economies. That's going to take us 20 years to do in order to build those economies and the industrial base to make those economies. And that's going to have to happen at the same time as we transform our food systems to build actually stable food systems. So why system thinking is important is in order to deal with our spatial justice issues, we're going to have to deal with our food justice issues, and we're going to have to talk about this stuff in a completely different way as we start to see increased volatility in the system. For me, this is a big structural issue. It is no longer marginal edge of landscape work. The final point I'd make here, and I'll hand over to the rest of the panel, is actually the level of, in crisis, in systems, I would argue it is crisis which drives transformation. I no longer believe that politicians will be able to get ahead of the crisis. What will happen is actually how you respond in crisis. And the Overton windows that shatter at the moment of crisis, what do you do at that moment in time? What did we not do in 2008? What did we not achieve in COVID? Those are the radical reform moments that we're going to have available to us. And the question is whether we're prepared for those systemic reforms in those moments of systemic crisis. So crisis will open up windows of Overton window for structural reforms. And I think what we should be talking about is the nature of crises that we will face over the next 5-6 years, which are increasingly apparent. Whether it's a housing crisis, whether we see structural housing crisis reform, we're going to see that. Whether it's actually a monetary crisis, OECD is already predicting some form of global monetary crisis between the next 5 to 10 years. What is our innovation space responding to that? How do we democratize money, money formation, and other means of capitalizing the world around us, all the way through to food systems and food systems reform and land systems reform? So my only plea is system thinking is not like, oh, it's nice, I did a diagram. Right? It's not that. I did a system map, we're done. System thinking, for me, is about actually getting into the structures of transformation. And my final plea here is that I don't think we're in 2004 anymore. Like, solving an edge of market issue with a novel solution for a small group doesn't work. We are in structural market reform moments, and markets will not reform without actual forcing functions of new theories of regulation and governance, which are going to be critical. Otherwise, hello, we're in a self-terminating moment.
Fantastic. That's a great sort of window opener into a big picture for the rest of the session. So thank you very much indeed, Indy. Conor, over to you.
If I could have my, sorry.
The clicker.
Yeah, the clicker. Thank you. Hopefully that will work. Yeah, great. We were asked to talk about, sorry. I think this is the wrong presentation. So I will ignore the presentation. And go back. Anyway, I'll leave it. I'll leave it there. Okay. So I was asked to talk about what are the key principles of systems thinking. And for us, the key principles of systems thinking is a focus on the fundamentals of a problem rather than the symptoms of a problem. So the system that Share Action is working to change is the financial system. Why financial systems? Well, financial services companies play a dual role in the economy. They are companies themselves, but they also allocate capital to other companies, so they underpin the entire economy. If financial service companies themselves can change, that could influence the practice of businesses across the entire economy by the way they allocate their capital. So Share Action is dedicated to making the global investment sector responsible for its impacts on people and planet, whilst also making its power mobilizing its power to address challenges we face. Now, there's more than 112 trillion US dollars invested in financial markets worldwide, and that's set to be 145 trillion by 2025. And that money powers the real economy. Yet when so many companies are damaging our planet, as Indy just mentioned, our communities, our workers, we need to change the way that money is invested. Now, we also believe what's in the best interest of the people and planet is also in the best interest of investors. For instance, a healthy economy with less inequality, less climate change, is more likely to make higher returns. So particularly for long-term investors, such as pension funds. Now, all of us here who work, we automatically get enrolled onto a pension fund. And that automatically gets invested into companies. So we want our pensions to be healthy. We don't want it to, but it won't be healthy if we don't tackle inequality and climate change. Now, Share Action drives change in company behavior by working with their investors, the ultimate owners of large companies. We hold the investment system to account on climate change, biodiversity, public health, and good workforce standards. So our entire theory of change is around systems change. We work to change the decisions made within the financial system, so the way the investment industry finances companies leads to better outcomes. And so that brings me to the campaign that I run, which is ethnicity pay gap reporting, which is a clear example of our approach. This campaign came about after the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement and the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the lives of ethnic minorities. Now, we run an investor coalition, a Good Work investor coalition, with 47 investors with 4.2 trillion in assets under management. And they share our vision of having of the investment system campaigning for good workforce standards and protect good workforce practices. So some of our members, they wanted to tackle racial inequality in the workforce when the whole COVID and Black Lives Matter started to happen. And also because so much research demonstrates that black and minority workers suffer disproportionately from low pay than white workers. Now, we didn't want to just deal with the symptoms. We wanted to address the root cause. So we consulted civil society organizations and discovered that reporting on the ethnicity pay gap is a vital first step in tackling racial inequality in the workplace. So what is ethnicity pay gap? It's the difference between the average pay of a white worker in an organization with the average pay of a non-white worker. And that's different to equal pay, which is a legal requirement to pay the same to people doing the same job of equal value. So our campaign, it fits Share Action's goal, which is to have an investment system that reflects society it serves. So one that is diverse and inclusive at all levels. Now, given the power of the financial sector, if there's economic inequality within the financial sector, it's likely to have an outsized impact on the real economy. So, we are encouraging a diverse workforce. We believe that ethnicity pay gap reporting would encourage a diverse workforce and in turn could impact capital allocation and promote a positive impact in the real economy. We also want institutional investors to understand that asking companies to publish their ethnicity pay gap will provide them with a clear idea on how companies are performing and how they can apply pressure. It's also in the investors' interest. Black and minority ethnic talent can boost the economy by over £24 billion a year. The ethnicity pay gap campaign builds upon the success of the Living Wage campaign, which led to over 50 FTSE 100 companies becoming living wage accredited employers. When we began, there were only 2. And the impact didn't just stay there, as FTSE 350 companies now are also accredited employers as well as smaller employers. So as a result, over 460,000 workers received a pay rise. This is systems change. It didn't just benefit workers in 1 or 2 companies, but in 14,000 UK businesses. So systems change is making a change at scale. So with the Ethnicity Pay Gap campaign, we pull several levers. Firstly, we're educating and influencing institutional investors on ethnicity pay gap reporting. We published an investor toolkit this year on ethnicity pay gap reporting that examines the barriers to reporting and what investors can do to tackle it. Secondly, we directly engage with companies to drive change in company behavior. So we facilitate investor engagement meetings with companies on the topic of ethnicity pay gap reporting. And we make the same ask of all companies to try to get them to a level of practice that is in line with tackling racial inequality. The power of working with institutional investors is that they can take a systemic view of their holdings. So, because their holdings cover the entire economy, or the majority of the economy. So, through engagement, they can set a baseline for company behavior. Thirdly, we're empowering civil society and minority workers to engage with our network of companies and investors. That's to demand change. So we want to be a conduit between civil society and the corporate sector. We're recruiting and training minority workers to ask questions at annual general meetings on ethnicity pay gap reporting. We're going to be partnering with the GMB Union on their Racial Advancement Scholarship Programme so that we can engage with affected communities on our campaign. And finally, we educate and influence policymakers on ethnicity pay gap reporting. We don't want to just stop at voluntary reporting, as we're all campaigning for mandatory reporting, like gender pay gap reporting, which was made mandatory in 2017. Mandatory reporting would go that step further by levelling the playing field and drive accountability, transparency across all large employers. And this would have a large impact on minority workers. So we produced a policy brief on the case for mandatory reporting in September, and we're engaging with policymakers. And the Labour Party have pledged to make ethnicity pay gap reporting mandatory. I think I will stop there. So basically, the financial system has a significant power in shaping our economic system, and it's key that financial actors use this power for good.
Fantastic, thank you. Yes, a very great sort of specific example of an area of work that's taking a sort of systems approach to a really important issue. Dan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So I'm going to try and use the... I'm going to try and use this. I hope this isn't digging into my 10 minutes.
No, you're fine. You're doing well. You're doing well. You're all right.
There we go. Great. I just want a moment of clarification. If you are expecting me to be an economist, despite the fact that I'm from the New Economics Foundations, I'm very sorry, I'm not, so I won't be talking about economic policy, macro, or finance either. But I can probably put you in touch with the right people who would be able to. So yesterday, I was in Manchester working with over 40 people from organisations across the city, but also the surrounding towns of the city as well, like Rochdale. They were sharing their experience of what it was like to live below the poverty line, to not be able to pay their heating bills, to not be able to pay for their children to have hot meals. They also shared with us what it was like to interact with the job centre, which was really hugely dehumanising for them. But despite that, we had all come together to imagine what life could look like if no one had to live below the breadline. We were there to design a living income, a minimum income guarantee in a place, something that people have been calling for since Martin Luther King said that the solution to poverty is to guarantee it directly with a guaranteed income. So we were there also to organise people around a living income. And right across the UK, it's really clear that we are gripped by a crisis of inequality. And here at Toynbee Hall, it's really stark. In the shadow of the City of London, where so much wealth resides on the one side, cheek by jowl with some of the poorest wards in the country on the other. But this country is also gripped by a crisis of power, which is actually what I want to talk about more today. So right across the country, everyday people have lost their sense of agency. They feel increasingly disenfranchised and locked out of politics. And we need to change this with a fierce urgency of now. I'm going to talk more about why building the power of people and developing their leadership is so critical to the systems change that we want. But I'm going to just say a little bit about why it matters to me, and you get a sense of who I am and why this matters. So in 1984, aged 10 years old, I moved from the north of England, which was in the midst of the miners' strike, of which some of my family were involved, to Winchester, which was one of Europe's wealthiest cities, if not the wealthiest city. I took my first paid job working as a kitchen porter in Winchester College, one of Britain's most exclusive schools. You may know it, it's where Britain's elite send their kids to learn how to rule Britain and to rule the world. And it's where I used to wash Rishi Sunak's pots. Every Saturday morning, I would walk past the Victorian double-fronted manor house and would walk around the back entrance, past the pig swill bins, and into the bowels of the school's kitchen. Putting on my kitchen apron, this is not me then, by the way, this is some time previously, while witnessing hundreds of boys sit down to dine together at these massive oak tables, surrounded by oil paintings of Britain's former empire leaders, being taught that it was their birthright to rule. And I remember that making me feel so angry. You see, I didn't grow up believing that leadership was about the birthright of a few people. I'd seen from both my mum and dad working unselfishly to uplift people. My mum worked with women who were survivors of domestic violence to discover their collective power. And my dad championed young people in the care system to demand a good education for themselves. And it was washing pots in Winchester College that taught me about Britain's deep inequality, but my mum and dad that showed me that if we want a different kind of country, we need to build a different kind of leadership. There are millions of people in this country that have been written off because of the postcode that they're born in, the housing block they live in, or the education that they didn't get. So when we ask the question, how is it possible that almost 50% of children live in families that live below an acceptable standard of living, it is because, in my view, we haven't organised with the people that would most benefit from that change. We haven't built the collective power and the leadership of those people that have the most to win to demand the change that is needed. Since Thatcher, our neoliberal economic model has sought to divide us, individualise us, atomise us, racialise us, and strip us of the values that connect us. It's turned relationships into transactions, filling the gaping holes with rabid consumerism. One of the most devastating impacts of neoliberalism that I've seen, whether in cities like London or Manchester or towns like Rotherham, where we've been working, has been the erosion of this sense of interconnectedness, what I call a sense of love. And over the last 40 years, an assault on civil society, the mediating institutions that bring people together and protect them from some of the worst excesses of the market, has forced apart our interconnectedness and our ability to build political relationships with people from different backgrounds and find common cause. This has been mirrored in the kind of assault on the trade union movement as well. And it's in this context that politicians like Donald Trump, despite serving the interests of a minority of super-rich white men, are able to win. So, what do we need to do? All of this happens, in my view, because we haven't invested enough in the labour, the love, or the resources of organising the communities that would most benefit from the systems change that we want. Yes, I do mean money. According to the Civic Power Fund, only 0.3% of UK foundation money in 2021-2022 went towards building people power through organising. But I also mean the investment in the leadership of people that would most benefit from systemic change that we're seeking. And when things feel so urgent, whether that's child poverty, inequality, or climate breakdown, it's no surprise that we often look for a quicker fix. A Twitter storm, a petition, an insider conversation can often feel a quicker route to change, but we are missing something really important. It's an investment in the rebuilding of the relationships, the connecting of people together from different backgrounds to be in relationship with each other around common cause that's so critical. Ultimately, organising is ultimately about investing in people and between people. It aims to address that sense of powerlessness, which if we want the systemic change that we are all looking for, we have to think about how to address this crisis of power. It's about investing in building thick relationships between people that perhaps have become disconnected from each other or weren't connected at all. And it's thirdly about it's about justice. Good organising recognises the people impacted by injustice must also lead the fight to win. So it's ultimately about transferring power to everyday people. And to be honest, that's why so many politicians and political parties and some progressive organisations fear it. It demands leadership. Not the elitist leadership I witnessed washing pots at Winchester College, but the collective leadership of us in this room and those who will most benefit from the systemic change we all demand. So I'm just going to finish off by saying a little bit, I want to finish off in Toynbee Hall actually. 2011, I started my first organising job. And we built an organisation of about 25 organisations. So that ranged from Kurdish workers' organisations to local primary schools, to colleges, to churches. And one of the big issues that came out from that, and I'm going to finish by saying something about the living wage quickly, but was I had a conversation with a woman called Birgul Aksu, who was a mum at a local primary school. And she told me about the fact that her children were living in damp housing conditions with black mould that was impacting on their health. It was impacting on their missed days of school, and it was also impacting on GCSE results for a school in an area with significantly high levels of inequality. And through that conversation, and through Birgul's leadership, but she'd never seen herself as being a political person before, she was able to organise largely the mums across largely working class schools in the local area to build a campaign to demand that the damp in the homes surrounding the local primary schools was fixed. And they were able to get a 1.5 million investment in eradicated damp housing conditions. As a result of that, building that power collectively, that team within 12 months went on to win living wage internships for local young people, apprenticeships within the tech sector, hundreds of them, living wage jobs locally as well, and were part of making the London Olympics the first ever living wage Olympics. But that was rooted in building the leadership of people like Billy and collectively organising with others around those issues as well. The living wage, we've talked about it quite a few times today already, so I just kind of want to finish on this quickly, which is the living wage. Does anyone know where the living wage campaign started? Just a quick hand up if you do. Do you want to go?
No.
Sure?
Well, it started in the East End. It was after a cleaner at HSBC demanded.
Yeah. So interestingly, that is correct, but it actually started before then in East End of London. It actually started in a church basement, but with a conversation between parents who were asked a question, what are you most struggling with at the moment? And all the people in that room basically said they were struggling to spend time with their children because they weren't earning enough money, because they were having to make 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. And as a result of that, the living wage was born in that basement and has now become, obviously, a national campaign of real significance for thousands of people across the country as well. Back in Manchester yesterday, I heard a lot of painful stories, but I also heard a lot of hope in bringing people together. In just a few weeks, people have gone from believing that politics will never work in their interests to believing that building those relationships together and believing in each other across communities, cultures, faiths and neighbourhoods, are now dreaming that perhaps a living income is possible.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dan, and thank you, everyone. Yeah, round of applause. Yeah. So we've got a good bit of time for discussion. I've got a couple of questions just to sort of start things off with the panel, and then I'll open it up to the wider floor. I'd like to start by a couple of you, actually all of you, in different ways in your presentations, talked a bit about finance, about capital markets, about how resources are allocated or indeed misallocated. I wonder if you could each say a little bit more about, particularly as I know quite a lot of people in this room work on issues related to, broadly speaking, the finance system or capital markets. So where would you see sort of fruitful places to start in thinking about trying to drive a different approach, a change to the underpinnings of the system of finance and capital, which is clearly so critical to the whole sort of structure we're talking about? And I say, I'm not asking for you to give the whole answer because that's far too difficult, but places to start, or places that people in this room who are thinking about that aspect of the system might want to take a look. Who'd like to kick off? Kerry, yeah, please.
Well, I was talking about ethnicity pay gap reporting and tackling racial inequality, and what I would like to see the financial system do is have a set of clear standards that they work to tackle racism. With Jonathan Levy, it's something that we've been discussing from JRF, but creating something that's similar to the climate movement and net zero, where investors have a set of indicators that can work towards. If there could be some shared standards that investors can work towards tackling racism, and not just in the UK, but globally, given that we are an interconnected world. So we've been talking about living wages. So if there could be global living wages that investors here can set and agree, then yeah, that's something that I would like to see.
Great, thank you.
I feel like a bit of an outlier, but I suppose my systemic worry right now is, I don't know how, so in current policy terms, we're heading to between 2.7 to 3.1 degrees temperature. That's where we're headed. That's global average. That means land is 5 degrees warmer, and that means places like Birmingham are close to 8 degrees warmer, although there's higher levels of volatility and cooling. That's basically billions of people on the move or dead. So I suppose I'm a little bit concerned that we aren't quite understanding that. So there was a brilliant statistic which basically said, if you were to price social environmental costs into the S&P 100, 70% of the S&P 100 isn't left standing. It's finished. It doesn't exist. And I suppose what I'm saying that is that I think we're facing much more like World War II, restructural rebuild of our economy. And the question is, why aren't we having that conversation as opposed to trying to tinker with an economy which is terminating us? That's the first question. And the second question is, that's going to either happen to us or it's going to happen through us to crisis. So my current problem is that the capital markets are fundamentally self-terminating us, right? Second question, I suppose this is kind of just to add a bit of provocation. is why are we still thinking through units of labor? Why are we still thinking of organizing an economy through the idea of instrumentalization of humans to units of labor as functional units of orchestration for third-party organizing? Is there not another thesis of economy which is actually not about instrumentalized humans, but intrinsic economic behaviors where we actually create the capacity to care and do complex work in a different way? Why are we not talking about a much more structural idea of reform which liberates our humanity to care rather than actually more advanced, more efficient theories of labor, which I don't think get us home in either the entrapment that people feel. Like, I struggle to get to the end of the month, right? I'm not saying it for any sympathy. I'm saying this is increasingly a challenge for many people. And I think people feel entrapped in their lives and entrapped in the world around us. So how do we start to think about a new theory of freedom, which isn't a freedom of choice, but the freedom of being radically human? What does an economy look like that actually embodies this? You know, labor is an extension of a theory of slavery. If you look at its root causes, employment law isn't just an extension of a theory of slavery. So my plea in the system is slightly that I'm not sure we're being anywhere close to radical enough, and the radical isn't that radical considering it terminates us if we aren't. So, I don't know, that's where I sit. I'm much more sort of worried that I think we are facing much more akin to post-World War II rebuild of Europe. We're facing much more akin to structural rebuilding of our economies, and they're going to fall one after another in different formats as a result of volatilities in the system. And I would like us to be talking about what does that new Marshall Plan moment look like, and how are we going to do that at the scale and order that's necessary.
Great. Dan, do you want to?
I like your idea of being more radically human. And I think just kind of going off that, for me, it's one of the challenges that we face is also our ability, which is about being radically human, is also our ability to talk about financial markets and change that happens in financial market, the change we want in financial markets, in a way that also enables other people to feel like they can be part of the transformation of that. And so I think a big challenge that we have is actually about our ability to tell powerful stories, because we know that humans learn about values through storytelling. Just wanted a quick question for people in the room. How much time do you think parents spend telling stories to their children? So I'm going to give you 3 options: 20%, 60%, or 80%. So those that think it is 20%, can you put your hands up? Great, thanks. Those that think it is 60%, put your hands up. And those that think it's 80%, can you put your hands up? So actually only 3-4 people in the room think it's 80%. It's actually 80% of the time that parents spend with their children is spent telling them about the world, their values, through storytelling of one sort or another. But I think when we get to adulthood, we sometimes forget that actually how important storytelling is for understanding each other's values, building connections between each other, and actually turning the ability to go from things like fear to hope or apathy to action, which is so critical for us to get the systems change that we want as well. So I suppose in organising, we think about the kind of world in 2 ways. One is about 3 ways, I'd say. The heart, head, and the hands. The head is the strategy, the hands is the craft, the actual doing, and the heart is the storytelling. And I think there's a big job for us to do when we think about how we think about wanting to change, get system change in the economy and financial sector, we have to think about the stories that we tell each other and everyone else too.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to ask pick up one more question, then we'll throw it out to the floor in just a few minutes. So I want to pick up actually on Dan's point about stories and how important they are. And I wonder if any of you have got an example you'd like to share of when you've heard that done really well, great storytelling. I mean, either something you've been directly involved in or something you've come across, sort of help bring that to life a bit for the audience. What does great, effective storytelling for change look like? And say maybe an example or someone you know does this well, or sometimes you've experienced it deliver something. Any of you've got something like that to share would be fantastic. If you haven't, that's fine too. But
I can give. Look, one of the things I was in Plymouth with Pop Plymouth and community organising, just vast, amazing Methodist hall, literally everyday people, right? And the big realisation I had I ended up having to give a pretty tough speech, like. And what I found fascinating is on the ground, people were like, thanks. This is already the world I feel, you've just given words to it. Whereas I sit in Westminster or some sort of mediated, they were like, oh, sorry, Indy, no one's going to really understand that. I was like, bollocks. People on the ground get this faster than any of the intermediaries or any of the kind of politicians because they're viscerally feeling this stuff. And I think the politics on the ground is fundamentally different from the intermediate Twitter landscapes that we all end up kind of making opinions from. You get on the ground, people can feel the energy, food, all these issues are real, and what you are doing is coding. You're giving them language to put into things that they're feeling. So one of the things that I'm finding extraordinary right now is the conversation on the ground is much more real, much more advanced than anywhere close to the conversation that I get into politicians or political advisors. That gap is, I think, a very interesting moment. And I would say, since you've got Martin Luther King, this is the Martin Luther King moment. This is the moment where you don't organize with the politicians. This is where you organize on the ground because they are willing to hear and they need the words because that's where the new politics is being born. It's not being born in the intermediate landscapes. Their Overton windows are far too small to be able to shift anything, frankly.
Anyone else like to add anything on that theme before I throw it open? Or yeah.
So I once was at an event, again, about racial inequality, and the lady was talking about shared interests, like what's in our interest. So I agree with what you're saying, Indy, but to get actual things to change, we do need to speak to politicians and people in power, but we need to appeal to what's in it for them, and that's the issue. So I think that's why your words resonated with the people on the ground, because, you were talking about them. But unfortunately, we need to sort of find ways to get people to identify, or we need to sort of talk their language.
Yeah, very good. There's the living wage story, I think, is actually a great story, which you were talking about earlier on, which is that. I can't remember the year that this happened, but it happened at HSBC, which is where Share Action, this came out of Catherine Howarth's work, right? And one of the people that was involved in Citizens UK was a guy called Abdul Durant. He was a cleaner at HSBC, and he was obviously not earning a living wage at that time. And so an AGM was organised. So John Bond, who was leading the bank at the time, was in the AGM, and Citizens UK, who Abdul Durant was part of, I think it was the East London Mosque, that one of the members just down the road from here, and they bought shares in HSBC and went to the AGM, and Abdul Durant, when it got to the questions time, Abdul Durant had a question for the panel. And he stood up and said, we work in the same office, but lead completely different lives. I am here when you're at home, cleaning your office. And when I'm not here, you're here moving finance around. And I would like you to pay me and the other staff here a living wage. And as a result of that action and the story that Abdul Durant told at HSBC at that point, that's when HSBC became one of the first living wage employers in the country. And Catherine Howarth, who was leading that, then went on to set up Share Action, right? Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm going to throw it open because we've taken it. I'm going to take 2 or 3 comments from the floor and then pitch them up to the panel for comments. So I've got one right at the back there.
Hi there, Andrea Westall. I was at a conference all weekend, so I obviously asked a lot of questions anyway. So here, if you can hear me. Indy, I'm with you on the need for structural change, but I need to kind of get in my head that story so I know how it works. I was on a commission for the European Parliament, and they were actually being pretty radical. So it was things like trying to rethink what would the welfare state look like, to really think about a world of volatility. It was called a socio-ecological welfare state, stupid name, but you know, the whole point about how it was working. What I'd love to hear is more about governance, because how we make decisions and how we act is how we do that urgency bit, which is what is the key thing. But also on the finance sector, the one question that you haven't really answered yet is we know from Thomas Piketty, you know, the rate of return going to capital versus wages is so far apart that even if we tinker on the edges about making that finance more equitable, etc., and recognise it goes to our pensions, that gap remains. So how do we manage what clearly has to be a reduction in that return to capital, as well as ensure that we all have a lifetime of support?
Excellent. I had one question down here.
Yeah, just briefly. I wanted to say this about the systems change. I agree with what you're saying. I've been, I get a really clear insight to systems change from Dana Meadows, because of the great writers on systems change. And if you want transformational change, which I agree with you, we need it. We have to have transformational change. You've got to get to the deeper leverage points. And so often what we're dealing with are the shallow ones. And I've just pulled up an article which I was reading here. And unfortunately, the shallowest leverage points, which tinker with the system and don't transform the system, include changes to subsidies, taxes, standards. I think we've got to question ourselves whether what we're really doing, it's all good stuff, and a living wage rate, putting the rate up, it does not transform the system. And transformation, the deep leverage point for transforming the system comes from a change in values and the change of the values. Just very briefly, there are 2 ways you can change the values. You can educate the people who already have the power in the system to change their values. And a lot of transformational work is involved in doing that. Question yourself whether that's what you're doing. I think that's not going to work. We have to change the people with different values who change the system. And I put this as a challenge to Friends Provident, that actually in your transformational models, you need to identify systems which change the individuals with power in the system at a deepest level, and then you'll get the transformation. And too many, and I'm guilty of it, we're all guilty of it, we spend our time fiddling with little minor things which cannot and will not bring around transformational change.
There's a comment over there. Okay, yeah. Lady here, yeah. And then I'll pitch you back to the panel and get some comments.
Hello, thank you all so much for your amazing talks. And I think I'm really interested in the urgency and the scale and the radical change that you're bringing, Indy. And then what Dan and Kunur have recognised in terms of change being slow and that we have to really work at shifting, building people's power and changing institutions. And I'm wondering, as a whole panel, what do you think are the tools to bring these 2 elements together, both making sure that we are really focusing on more radical structural changes of our system, but also thinking about, it sounded to me like Dan's kind of organising and the kind of shifting power of institutions bit that Kunur was talking about. They're all parts of the same puzzle, but are we really speaking to each other in how we connect both those power building pieces, the shifting institutions pieces, and having radical enough thinking? What are the tools to bring those pieces together as a movement?
Fantastic. So I'll attempt to summarise what I took from some of those questions and let the panel pick whichever bits of this you want. You don't have to speak to all of these things, but there was points around, so what's the government and governance elements that need to be in place to make radical change happen? Are there some sort of fundamentally underlying pieces about how capital works and returns that are expected on capital, and how that's baked into all sorts of things in the system that push us in directions that we may need to do something about? The question on what are the deeper leverage points with a sort of proposal that we think about values as part of that, and changing values as one of the levers for change, interesting people's thoughts around that. And then this sort of tension between urgency and pace and scale of challenge, and the fact that some of the tools and approaches that we've talked about are not necessarily rapid, and how we bridge some of those gaps between what we need to do and what the tools are to get there in the little time as possible. So just a few minor questions and thoughts from the floor here. As I won't ask you all to answer all of them, but who'd like to kick off picking up one or two of those? Anyone like to go first? Well, I'll just pick someone. Dan, why don't you go first?
I might leave the capital markets one. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I said I might leave the capital markets one, if you don't mind. I think that urgency and pace is really interesting. So, like, how do you create the bold ideas that are going to be totally transformative and do the deeper organising work at the same time that has breadth and depth? It's really interesting being part of this work in Manchester around the living income, because I had a conversation yesterday with a young man who's only 6 months out of being a drug addict, and he was saying that 6 months ago he could never have imagined himself being part of designing and thinking about how to win a living income in Greater Manchester. And actually only 3 weeks ago, when we brought people together, they were struggling to think beyond their very immediate experiences of what it was like to have to go to a job centre, to deal with getting benefits. And within a very short space of time, people's imagination for what's possible has grown massively. And so I think that the challenge around scale is also about how do we build that depth of work with people across the country to build enough power to actually get that kind of change that we're looking for. And obviously we can get into a conversation about how do you take deep organising to nationwide, national organising. And there's an approach that we can think about for how we build that kind of structure, and how we build effective teams, and how we build powerful stories, and how do we scale. But I think actually the ability to, people are not as far from the bold ideas, I think, as sometimes we may think they are as well, but it takes the time and work to work with people to be part of that transformation as well. And if we just do it in sort of elite level conversations with those in positions of power, we are not going to get that transformative change that we need. So the work of depth needs to be done. I think just coming to the question, ultimately I think the question, sorry, what was your name? Chris. Chris, I think Chris's question also, very interesting, like how do you shift people's values? I think you can only do that by, again, I would argue that those insider conversations are not going to be where values are shifted. Values are going to be shifted when people build collective power around the big systemic issues that we want to transform the country around. And it's in that confrontation, to use an antagonistic word, but in that relationship that actually you will get the sort of value shift that you need. But that comes back to me for needing to do the work of the power building, which is so critical to making that happen.
Great, thanks, Dan. Okay, do you want to?
Yeah. So just on that, I feel that people already have those values. When polls are done, we want to avoid climate change and so on. But unfortunately, those people with those values aren't in power, or they don't have the financial power. And so when I mentioned earlier that one of ShareAction's goals is to have a diverse and inclusive investment system. So we need more people who look like me and Indy and, you know, just people from different socioeconomic status, LGBTQI, disability. You know, we need the investment system to reflect society, but unfortunately, most of investors are white, male, and middle class, and they are ruling our economy. So we need more of ordinary people to become investors, I think, because they have those values, they share those values. I mean, that's not necessarily true, because you look at people like Suella Braverman, who gets into power, and she's, a brown woman, so that's not always the case. But we do need people who already have those values to start becoming investors. And secondly, the lady, what you were saying, yeah, I love that idea, I love that. We are working with affected communities, but we are struggling to work with affected communities. So we only just got this partnership with the GMB Union to work with their Racial Advancement Scholarship Program. But that's something we're struggling with, to not just change institutions, but work with affected communities to empower them to be able to influence institutions, because it's very powerful. Like what Dan mentioned when at HSBC, Abdul Duran actually asked that question. It's very powerful coming from him. So we need more of that voice being heard. And yes, your question, I think perhaps again, if you go back to if people in power become, or people with our values end up in power, are holding investors to account, then we need to also understand whether we're willing to reduce our returns as pension holders. And so we need to have that honest conversation, and that needs to be more visible.
Okay. How many people here are vegan? Put your hands up, please. Okay, few. So if you know the science of climate change, it's pretty indefensible not to be vegan. I'm not saying that as a moral issue. I'm saying when we talk about we're the good guys, I'm not vegan, right? So I'm not making a claim here. But what I'm trying to say is we're the good guys. How many people here buy less than 1 or 3 pieces of clothing a year? Okay. That's basically what you can afford. So this shirt, it's £25, £30 shirt. Its true cost, if you price in social and environmental goods, is somewhere between £250 to £450. Not 1.2, Varial, £250 to £450. All those additional costs are carried by the earth. We externalize those costs. So my first point is, yeah, we think we have the values, but the deviation between the values and trying to live them is a massive structural move. Second thing, and I think we have to recognize even the good guys, we're all acting like Trump. Right? We're all Trump in this moment. Let's not outsource this to somebody else. Hats off to the few vegans. Really appreciate that. No, but genuinely, no joke. I really appreciate it, right? You guys are showing the way. Second, I think you're absolutely right. Our theory of how we organize democracy is not working. A democracy, and I think our societal decision-making capacities are not working to deal with the complexity and the speed of transformation. And we need to build radical democratic reform to the table, because that's the only way we're going to move at speed and agility with legitimacy. We saw in COVID, there was speed, certainly no legitimacy, vast amounts of capture. And we're going to face multiple crises, and those are all going to be rent-seeking crises, or crisis of consolidation of wealth, or actually all sorts of stuff where we see crisis, disaster capitalism. So we have to get democratic reform. Then I think we have to talk about regulatory reform in radical formats. There's no way this market, through laissez-faire economics, recorrects itself towards dealing with all its externalities and all its free resource base. It's all dead. The market doesn't work. Most of our corporate system does not work in a socially or environmentally adjusted world. It doesn't work. So there's no way it's going to self-terminate itself. So we are going to have to find a new theory of forcing functions to drive this transition. That's going to mean sunsetting industries. So Poor examples, but extraordinary in their own selves. UK abolished slavery by spending 25% of GDP to abolish slavery. Unfortunately, it only recapitalized the banks using that money. It didn't actually compensate anyone. But that was a scale of order of sunsetting industries, sunsetting ideas that we're going to need. So where is our reform at that scale? I think you're right about the kind of deep leverage questions, but the questions we should be asking are monetary formation, beyond property, and beyond labor. Right? If we're not talking beyond labor, beyond property, and our theory of monetary formation, we're not deep into the system enough. How many people here are working on smart central bank currencies and their future? 1. Brilliant. 2. We need to be working there because that crisis is going to be material and it's going to massively centralize power or democratize power depending on how we organize that world. So are we working at the leverage points in those frameworks? And I think your point about are we being radical enough, my gut feeling is that I think we're not. I don't even think we're having the conversations that allow for our radicalness to actually come to the table. And I no longer think even the word radical is sufficient. I think it's appropriate to the scale of the challenge. That's it. It's not even radical. Are we being appropriate to the scale of the challenge that we face? And most of these challenges are visible. And the third, final thing I'd say is that my unfortunate view is that as 2008, I think there were, 12 people in the world that came together to rebuild the financial system. There was a small number of people that did that. The question is, when crises happen, it's going to be a small number of people that are going to actually recode the system. The question is, are we ready to be able to influence that small cabal? Or what will that future look like? And how do we make crisis how are we prepared for crisis-based transformation? So are we being radical enough? Not yet. Are we really examining? Theory of property is rooted in our current crisis, I would argue. In order to construct property, you have to create objectification. In order to construct property, you have to create a boundary. In order to create property, you have to create asymmetric rights. People talk about property rights, not property responsibilities, right? So we've created asymmetric capabilities which allow for extraction and externalization in the system. So I'm not sure we're being radical enough. I'm not even actually, more worryingly, I'm not sure we're being appropriate enough to the scale of the challenge that's visible, and it's a full stack problem all the way down. And that is both scary, but also an extraordinary invitation, because I think we're going to have to rebuild our system, perhaps a 1 in a 400-year cycle, in an extraordinary invitation to rebuild the world around us. That is the invitation for our generation, to rebuild that. I don't think we're being appropriate yet to the scale of the challenge.
Fantastic, thank you all. I'm going to take probably a couple more points from the floor, have another round with the panel, and then we'll be out of time. So, I've got far too many, I'm not going to be able to get to everyone, sorry. But so I'll take hand over here. Has someone got the mic to pass around so people online can hear? Jake, so, yeah. Chap down here, and then we'll pivot over across there.
Hey, thank you for your presentations. My name is Noah. I'm the co-director of Climate Vanguard. We're a youth-led think tank that works with youth climate organizers. And I guess what I was missing from this panel is actually a candid discussion against the system that we're up against. And I'll kind of flesh that point out by some of the research that we've done. We did a global map of the youth climate movement and identified the 290 plus youth climate campaigns that exist. And we put out a survey that asked, first off, is the system responsible, this so-called system? 54%, yes, the system is to blame for climate and ecological breakdown. Of that 50+%, 92% said it is capitalism and colonialism. And I guess my question to you is the system capitalism? And if the system is capitalism, how can we actually create an anti-capitalist movement to overcome it? Because I feel like we're kind of being around the bush. We're talking about the financial system, we're talking about neoliberalism, but actually to forge an economy that meets people's material needs within planetary boundaries. I and many other young people don't think that is possible within the capitalist system. So I'd like to hear your remarks on that.
Excellent. Okay, we'll take a hand over here. Jake, if you go here.
Thank you very much. I guess maybe building a little bit on that point, my name's Carrie, I'm the co-director of Movement Building at the New Economy Organisers Network. I guess for me, sitting underneath a lot of the discussion here and a lot of the comments that have come up is like, we're all sort of operating within a capitalist system and all of us are sort of, I guess, broadly working for social change organizations and are also doing so within capitalism, which sort of drives us as organizations to be in competition with each other for funding and resources, and to work with a kind of like pace and urgency that often decenters care and the kind of care and deep organizing work that's needed in order to build this like radically different future. And I guess I'm just interested to hear the thoughts of people on the panel about like what would help resource that. What can funders do? What can we do as organizations to kind of be in genuine collaboration with each other to kind of move away from this binary thinking into more kind of like both and thinking, because we need the radical imagining, we need the governance change, we need the people trying to leverage power, and we need people trying to like take people on that journey. There's a lot of people that aren't ready to be radical. There's a lot of people that are just terrified by the thought of climate collapse, which is very real, but also makes me feel like physically sick, you know, like there's a lot that needs to like move people in that direction as well. So I guess like how do we fund and resource those movements? And I guess if anybody has any thoughts about what infrastructure organizations like NEON can do, I'm open. So yeah.
Fantastic. Take one more thought, comment. Yeah, next, yeah.
Yeah, this is really short, but I feel very middle-aged, like I'm in my mid-40s, and I'm really glad that Noah spoke up and that you just spoke up, because, I mean, Indy, with all due respect, is it our generation that is going to solve this, or is it actually the next generations coming up? And when I look at a slide of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you know, I'm from St. Louis in the US, and, you know, it wasn't news to me when Mike Brown was killed and Black Lives Matter came about. But Black Lives Matter is a completely different kind of movement than what you have on the slide there. It has a different way, you know, young people have a different way of organizing. They talk about values. They already have their own new values. It's just that nobody else is really catching up. So I guess I just want to put that back to the panel, is like, are we thinking of this like in the wrong way in terms of generations and where change is really going to happen?
Okay, so we've got a few minutes left, so I'll ask each person to give some final thoughts, both responding to the floor and any other final wrap-up you want to do. So again, sort of horribly paraphrasing people's contributions, but sort of, so a question about, is this basically about capitalism, and where is an alternative going to come from, and how does that manifest? Something about resourcing the kind of systems change work you've talked about, and how do we get that to work more effectively, and then a sort of generational shift, and how does that play into this? So feel free to comment on any of those and any final other sort of wrap-up points you'd like to leave people with, and I'll come back down in reverse. So start with Indy and work back down this way.
Yep, totally. A couple of points. I think the capitalism point is yes. But I think we have to look at the structures of capital, the coding of capital. That's why I talk about property and labor. I think otherwise it ends up just becoming this big amorphous thing. There are some really interesting things to be done in our theory of going beyond property as a coding of capital, and there's some really interesting things to be done about our theory of labor and actually challenging theory of labor as a means of organizing. Yes, but let's delve into the kind of what is the problem space. So I agree. Second thing about intergeneration, my big worry is this is a 10-year problem, not a next generation problem. Either our generation does this or we're dead in the water, frankly. So if you look at so this idea we're going to hand over to the next generation, isn't it quaint? We've just handed over. It's not. It's all of our fucking lives. Either we do it together or we're all dead. That's okay. But I just don't think there's a kind of intergenerational handover here. I think we're all in it together. That's it. Second, the final point, there was one other point which I wanted to pick up. Resourcing, yes. Look, I want this conversation next year to be 1,000 people, right? It is a shame that this is this number of people. We need foundations, frankly, to be drawing down vast amounts of money at this moment in time, to be actually funding. We've been used to living in austerity and £10,000 checks to try to do big change. It's a joke. We need to radically 10x multiply the capitalization of this movement, and we have to scale the number of people in this room. Because it's the urgency. I don't care about the money. It's the urgency and the timescale of the problem requires those resources to shift. So everything you can do, and all power to the great work that you're doing. No. So I would say that should be our ambition. 10x this room, 10x the resources, and move at speed. Because I think this crisis moment will actually be really, really fast, and they're going to keep coming. So how do we move there? That would be my invitation to every foundation that's watching and organizing, moving at speed right now. Run down your endowments, frankly. It's not going to be worth much in 10 years' time because we'll be nothing left to protect, frankly.
Okay, so capitalism. Yes, I agree. I think the issue is that how do we get people behind that idea? Yes, you know, lots of young people in the West who want to change capitalism, but if you then go to people in India and Bangladesh and other countries, you'll find that they will say, well, you've benefited from capitalism. You've got this greater living standards, and we want that. So, you know, we want capitalism. So I think it is about education, but it's also about the media. I think we are enthralled by the media. The media is our Bible. We follow what it says, and unfortunately, and it's polarizing and it divides everyone. And I think that might be the nub of all our issues. So, you know, a lot of us here are going to be seen as, you know, climate radicals, and people get, you know, sick of our, you know, actions, our activism. And that's because of what they're drip-fed by the media. So if we're going to change capitalism, I think we need to change its key messenger, which is our media. And resources, yes, definitely, we need more resources. And I think foundations, it's great that you're looking at systems change. There needs to be more foundations who look at systems change. And I think perhaps the role of foundations that are funding systems change work, they need to educate and influence other foundations. And what was the final question? Oh, generation. Yeah, generational. Yeah, I agree. It's our fault. So, you know, us older people. But yeah, as Indy said, everyone needs to get involved, all ages and backgrounds. But again, it goes back to that question, what's in it for me? And for older people who just don't see the point of activism, perhaps. Not a lot of older people are activists, but if, say, the majority aren't, then again, it's to do with the media that's influencing them. That's what I think.
So I'm going to start on the generational approaches. I think the US has got an interesting example at the minute where around climate, which is obviously the Sunrise Movement, which had huge impact over quite a short period of time. And I think people who don't know what that is, maybe explain them. So Youth Climate Movement in the US, I'm sure people have probably heard of them as well. They followed a particular mobilizing, organizing method from called the momentum approach, basically. And they have been re-evaluating what their mobilizing approach looks like. And I know that they've been doing some work with Marshall Gans in the USA about thinking about actually how do we build an effective organizing structure that has democracy at its heart, that builds the leadership of people right across the country within the youth climate movement as well. So there's been a whole look at, yes, young people may be doing things differently, but actually in terms of building movements and collective organizing, the approaches actually to effective approaches to doing it, sustaining it over a long period of time, have not changed dramatically since the civil rights movement. A lot of those structures and approaches to organizing are still fairly similar, and it's interesting to think that organizations like Sunrise are looking at how they do that kind of stuff as well. And obviously adapting it, right? Adapting those approaches as well is really, really important. On the resourcing side, I totally agree. I think on two different levels, you know, I was in Greater Manchester yesterday for the living income stuff. We have, you know, that work that we're doing in Greater Manchester, the money runs out in less than 6 months' time. And we're on the beginning of this amazing transformational journey of something that is quite visionary, transformational, with everyday people rooted at the centre of making that happen. So I think there is a massive need for thinking about longer term funding that is invested much more collectively. How do we get out of competing with each other around when there is an existential crisis that we're facing around climate and capitalism? And we need to think much more collectively about how we address these issues. Think about building our collective power, and resources need to go into that. But I also think we need to be better at, and this may be a strange place to say this, we need to be better at owning our own money as well. You know, we need to be better at raising money that is membership money, that is collective money as well, because obviously that increases your ability to build your power as well. So I think getting that balance right between big funding pots, which are essential, and also raising other sustainable sources of income are really critical to how we think about organising and building movements together as well. And I think, yes, if we are to address this crisis of climate crisis, we have to go beyond capitalism. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier on, but that requires us to really also think about how we build the collectivity and sense of community of people right across the country, so that they can also reclaim their agency in that struggle as well.
Fantastic. Look, we are, I'm afraid, out of time on this first panel. This could easily take the whole day, I think, but I'm sure you also will probably want a break, an opportunity to chat. So I'm not going to attempt to summarise that, as we've covered everything from the entire future of the planet and humanity down to individual stories and individual places, from Greater Manchester to Winchester to the cost of Indy's shirt and everything in between. So we've gone very big picture and then the very small individual stories that bring it all to life, for which I'm incredibly grateful to the panel for covering that sweep and scale and breadth and the amount of provoking thoughts and insights you've brought. So I'm very, very grateful. Thank you very much indeed. And please show your appreciation.